So, not too long ago, the UN Security Council held a pretty intense meeting to talk about the protests happening in Iran. But according to the source material we're digging into today, this was way less about diplomacy and a whole lot more about some high-stakes political theater. Let's pull back the curtain and see what was really going on.
Wow, right? That incredibly sharp accusation came straight from Russia's envoy to the UN, and it pretty much set the stage for a huge confrontation. You had the United States on one side, and on the other, a surprisingly unified front from Russia, China, and Iran. The source we're using for this explainer basically sees this whole session as a drama, one that was carefully orchestrated by the United States, a drama that, in its view, completely unraveled by the end. So we're going to unpack that analysis, starting with Act 1.
All right, so Act 1 kicks off with the case being built by the United States. And look, they didn't just show up with statements. No, they brought witnesses to testify in front of the entire council, really trying to put a human face on their accusations.
Okay, so the official reason for calling this emergency meeting was all about how the Iranian government was handling widespread protests. The U.S. was making the case that this wasn't just, an internal issue. They argued it was a threat to international peace and security. And that's a really important phrase because it's the trigger for the Security Council to even get involved.
Now, here's where the source we're looking at starts to pick things apart. The two main witnesses, well, they were presented as voices of the Iranian people, right? But the source identifies them as U.S. citizens, and one of them, Masoumeh Alinejad, is noted as an employee of Voice of America, which is a media outlet funded by the U.S. government. So, according to the source, this immediately raised some big questions about whether they were really impartial representatives.
Alinejad gave this really passionate 15-minute speech, and she didn't just describe what was happening, she made a direct appeal for the UN to step in. She claimed the Iranian government was just immune to diplomacy, and that what was needed was, in her words, real and concrete action.
The second witness was Ahmad Batabi. He's been a resident in the U.S. since 2008, and he shared this very personal story about being arrested back when he was a student protester. His testimony was clearly designed to reinforce that narrative of a brutal, oppressive government.
Then, the U.S. representative stepped up and expanded the case way beyond just the protests. Suddenly, the accusations grew. Now it was about Iran being this primary destabilizing force in the entire Middle East. Its missile program was called a threat to its neighbors, which the source interprets as a not-so-subtle reference to Israel, and they were accused of funding groups like Hezbollah and Hamas.
And then you get this very modern, almost sci-fi detail that the source points out. The U.S. representative actually took a moment to publicly thank Elon Musk. Why? Because they confirmed that the Starlink satellite internet service was being used as a key source of information, essentially giving the Pentagon a direct intelligence pipeline. But the American case definitely did not go unanswered. And this brings us to Act 2, a swift, forceful, and really coordinated rebuttal from Russia, China, and Iran itself. This quote really gets to the heart of Russia's argument. Their envoy basically framed this whole meeting not as a legitimate security concern, but as a blatant violation of Iran's sovereignty, an attempt to meddle in its domestic politics using the UN as a stage.
Russia went even further, arguing this wasn't just a one-time thing. They said it was part of a 20-year-long anti-Iran agenda coming from Washington. And they gave a pretty stark warning, saying that this kind of American provocation could blow up and destabilize the whole region, and that they weren't going to let that happen. China jumped in, echoing that sentiment, but framing their opposition in these broader, almost philosophical terms. Their representative positioned China as a defender of international order against what they called American law of the jungle power plays. For China, it all came down to the UN Charter. They really stressed that Iran is a sovereign nation, its people have the right to make their own decisions, and any solutions had to be based on international law, not threats of force. Simple as that. And finally, Iran's representative got their turn, and they responded directly to the two witnesses. As you can see, they didn't pull any punches. They were dismissed not as representatives of Iranian civil society, but as pawns just pushing the political agenda of the United States and Israeli regimes. So why all this focus on regime change? To really get the source's analysis, Act 3 of this drama takes us back in time. The argument here is that this whole UN meeting is basically a modern-day echo of a really pivotal event from way back in 1953. And that event was Operation Ajax. It was a covert operation run by the US and the UK to overthrow Iran's democratically elected prime minister.
The source presents this not just as ancient history, but as the actual blueprint for what it claims the US was trying to do all over again. This timeline really lays out the whole chain of events. It all starts in 1951, when Iran decided to nationalize its massive oil industry, taking it away from British control. Just 2 years later, bam, the CIA and MI6 orchestrate a coup. They kick out that government and put the pro-Western Shah back in power. Of course, that same Shah was then overthrown decades later in the 1979 revolution, which created the Islamic Republic we know today. The source draws a direct line from that history to now, suggesting the ultimate goal was, once again, regime change.
So if the source is claiming the playbook was pretty much the same as 1953, why didn't it work this time? The analysis gives one key answer. The world is just a very, very different place now.
The analysis boils it down to 3 key things. First, internal unity. The Iranian government didn't buckle. Second, regional diplomacy. You had neighbors like Saudi Arabia and Qatar who, with some help from Chinese mediation, decided that stability was more important than intervention. And third, global opposition. That direct, unified pushback from Russia and China right there at the UN.
So the big takeaway from this source is pretty clear. In the world we live in today, that old playbook for intervention might just be obsolete. It argues that a nation with its own house in order and some powerful allies can actually successfully fight off external pressure for regime change. And just to close the loop on this story, the source reports that since that UN meeting, the internal protests have died down and the region's focus has snapped right back to prioritizing stability.
And all of that leaves us with the huge central question that this whole analysis brings up. When you look at that unified front from Russia and China, and you see these shifting allegiances in the Middle East, does this one single event signal something much, much bigger? Could it be that the era of a single superpower being able to shape global events all on its own is, well, coming to an end?